very, very warm virtual welcome to the Aga Khan Museum this morning. I am going to take you on a virtual tour of the museum, and Sam told me that many of you gave up a meditation session to be with me this morning, and I do hope that you will find that our virtual tour today is a meditation in its own right as we visit the museum and look at some of our masterpieces. I am a little bit sad, though, that I cannot actually welcome you at the door in person still after a year and a half, and that is why I'm waiting for you at the virtual entrance to our museum. And I'm now going to take you, as I would normally do, through the entrance area of the museum, which houses our beautiful museum shop, past the reception, to the spot in our atrium where I normally start my tours of the Aga Khan Museum, because it is a wonderful, light, meditative, soothing space. And it gives me the opportunity to just also tell you a little bit about the building itself and the site, the Winford site, because everything at Winford Drive is really designed in unison and emphasizing our mission, which is fostering pluralism through arts and culture. And if you were standing in the atrium now with me in person and looked across back through the entrance you came through, you would see both the Ismaili Center and the Aga Khan Park, which together with the museum make up the Winford Drive site. Now, the whole area was developed in 2014, 2015, under the patronage of His Highness the Aga Khan, who is the spiritual leader of the Ismaili Muslims. And if you know about his ethos, it is an ethos that very much aligns with the ethos of Canada, and that is bridging cultures, fostering pluralism, building positive multicultural societies in dialogue. And the whole site, the design of the site, was conceived by His Highness to already make the statement, because the Ismaili Center, which is the mosque, if you like, and community gathering space of the Ismaili Muslims, was designed by a Catholic Christian Indian architect called Charles Correa. The Aga Khan Park, which links the ICT and the Aga Khan Museum, was designed by a Serbian-Lebanese garden designer called Vladimir Jurovic. And the museum itself is designed by a Pritzker Prize-winning, internationally renowned Japanese architect called Fumihiko Maki. And Fumihiko Maki worked very, very closely with His Highness on designing a contemporary building that very much reflects the aspirations of Canada, while at the same time symbolizing the coming together of enlightenment through spirituality and human enlightenment that together bring a better, more positive thinking about societies and cultures in dialogue. And in terms of the architectural features throughout the building, you will find this coming together of internationally cutting-edge, modern, contemporary elements and aspects that are influenced and inspired by the contributions of Islamic civilizations across the ages. Now, the museum is arranged around the atrium, and we have, of course, permanent galleries. We have temporary exhibitions every year that draw on the themes of the mission of the museum, of the permanent gallery, and the broader topics that come from those. And we also have, of course, a large auditorium for our performing arts offerings and education spaces for school visits and adult and lifelong learning initiatives. So the first place I would like to take you through of our atrium is the so-called Bellerive Room. And this is where it is, just coming off our atrium. We've just walked around it to enter a cozy space that contains a collection of Islamic ceramics. Now, what is the history of this room, and why is it called the Bellerive Room? Obviously, the art collection in the museum, which shows the artistic and creative contributions of Muslim civilizations from the 7th through the 19th centuries, was initially brought together by His Highness and his family. And a very important contingent of the collection was actually given by His Highness's uncle, Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, and his wife, Princess Catherine, who lived in Geneva. And they had a small mansion in Geneva called the Chateau Bellerive. And that is where this room takes its name from. So when the museum was being conceived, the owners of Chateau Bellerive, Prince Sadruddin, Princess Catherine, who were avid collectors of art, and not only Islamic art, but also of world art, African sculpture, Picasso's, French furniture, etc. They really wanted to make their collection available to the citizens of Toronto and all visitors from Canada and further afield. And they also thought it might be a nice touch to actually recreate one of the rooms in their home, which held their Islamic ceramics in the museum. So what you see here is a loose recreation of one of their rooms at Chateau Bellerive with Islamic ceramics displayed from across the world, from the 7th century all the way through to the 17th century. Now, for Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, the collecting of art actually had a higher purpose. It was not only about being excited about the beauty and aesthetics of arts in general, but it was also for him a conduit to learn more about other cultures, because for much of his life, he was working with the United Nations. He was actually a High Commissioner for Refugees, and he was the first one who took the focus of the United Nations in terms of refugees beyond Europe after the Second World War and into the Southern Hemisphere. And each one of these objects are gateways into the lives and cultures of other peoples that over the centuries have contributed to the world we live in today. And I will take you now to the permanent collection. Let me take you around a little bit so you see a few of these works in a little bit closer up. So here, for example, we have a wonderful dish from the late 12th, 13th century from Iran. And through research, we have found out that this was actually used for New Year's celebration. So just as you today might put out your snacks and your nibbles when you get together with friends and families to celebrate the coming of the new year, so in Iran too, the New Year's celebrations of Nowruz which of course in the calendar actually happen in March at springtime, were also used to come together with friends and family to enjoy the special foodstuffs that were associated with that season. On this side, we have some wonderful ceramics from the more western part of the Islamic world, Ottoman Turkey. These beautiful plates here come from a pottery center in northwestern Anatolia called Iznik, and was supplying the imperial court in Istanbul, but also then creating for a much broader market, and also exporting in the 17th century, 16th, 17th century already to Europe, and influencing the development of ceramics in Europe. And we get to that a little bit further as we go to the permanent gallery. So let me just take you out again as we walk out, as it were, and I will take you to the permanent gallery, which is at the very end of our atrium. And our permanent gallery has about 1,200 objects from all over what we call the Muslim world, ranging in age from the 7th to the 19th century, and also now being added to with contemporary art commissions that we bring in dialogue with our historic pieces. Now, at the entrance of the gallery, we have a beautiful animation that shows you a little bit about the harmony and the balance in creating and designing artworks. And I hope this will play for you. If you can see this, there's a little video, and you can see that the animation on the wall is actually moving and showing you how some of these artworks are being painted and drawn and how they are unfolding. And of course, this is a very beautiful animation that tells us about the fact that in Muslim civilizations over the century, there was a great dedication to balance and the coming together of intangible arts like the spoken word and the physical arts like the written word and the material arts that reflect beliefs, philosophies, and ideas, poetry, literature, and also music. And the rhythms and the patterns and the mathematical principles of those symbolized in many ways the harmony of the universe and the geometric balance that underlies all these designs as they are unfolding and getting ever more complex, also reminded Muslims that it was ultimately all expressions of the creation and of the universe. And in terms of designing, when you remember going, when you were at school and you had to design geometric patterns, you would always start with an empty slate and you would put your compass on the paper and open your compass to draw a circle. And all the other geometric patterns that unfolded from that first move was then leading you to ever more complex designs. And the symbolism that for many Muslims underlies this action of designing complex ornaments is the point of your compass piercing the paper is the moment of the first creation of the universe by God. And then as it grows, as it unfolds, as it becomes ever more complex and expands to eternity, every single aspect in this grand scheme has its place and is irreplaceable. but at the same time, every single piece is also reliant on the whole in order for the harmony and the cohesion to continue. So it is a very beautiful philosophy that underlies the creation of these artworks and these ornaments. So let's have a look at some of those pieces and how the whole history really unfolded to start with. It really all started, of course, from the Muslim point of view, with the revelation of the Quran, which Muslims believe is the real direct word of God that was conveyed to the Prophet Muhammad through the intermediary of the Archangel Gabriel. Now, what is interesting here is that in the Arab tradition and the Arab society at the time, art in many ways was intangible. The highest art forms were poetry, were storytelling, were conveying historical genealogies through oral tradition, through passing on your wisdom and your knowledge to the next generation orally, memorizing it, and then passing it on again. So in the first instance, this ultimate artwork, if you want to think about it in terms of Muslim perception, was also received orally and initially conveyed to the first believers orally. And yes, of course, in the first decades, certain passages were also written down, but all in all, the Quran was preserved orally to start with in the tradition of the society of the Arabian Peninsula at the time. And the message became very successful, and it spread, and eventually by the later 600s and into the 700s, the Islamic force had moved out of the Arab Peninsula and had started as a political power to establish itself gradually from North Africa all across the Near and Middle East to the borders of China. And now there was a challenge, because in encountering these other cultures, and of course also these other political powers, they had a book. So for example, in their battles with the Christian Byzantine emperor, who was controlling most of the Mediterranean basin at the time, this Byzantine emperor was the representative of Christ on earth, and he had a Bible. And further east, as the Muslim forces were moving across Iraq, into Iran, into Afghanistan, there had been the Shah, who was understood to be the high priest of Zoroastrianism, and he had a book. So now suddenly it became ever more important to materialize the word of God, to have something that also to the newly conquered regions made the point that here had arrived a new force that was worthy of the legacy left behind, not only in terms of politics, but also in terms of religion. And at that point, in the mid-7th century, the Quran was written down and captured in one ultimate codex that then became copied and was distributed all over the new centers of power, and fundamentally became the original seed for all the Qurans that were created over the century and to this very day. And it is because of this importance of materializing the word of God that calligraphy became such a crucial art form. And from a Muslim point of view, if you go to Muslim countries today, to the Arab world, into Southeast Asia, which is actually today the pulsing heart of the Muslim world, you will find that calligraphy is still today considered as the most sublime and revered art form, because it is seen as the tool with which the word of God was materialized and therefore had to be of the very, very highest quality. And if you look, we have many different examples of Quran manuscripts, and you can see how much love and attention and beautiful geometric balance was exerted in these handwritten manuscripts of the Word of God. So another aspect that's important is the significance of the Arabic language, because the Quran was, let me just maneuver in the right place, was revealed in the language of Arabic. And therefore, Arabic became a very revered and important language. And of course, as the Muslims spread out of the Arab Peninsula across the Mediterranean world and North Africa and into the East, it became the language of religion and of government and also of intellect. It became kind of a lingua franca of intellectuals that were now working under Muslim rule from the Atlantic to the borders of China. And it is very important already at this point to say that the intellectuals that now came to contribute were not at all only Muslims. In fact, for the initial centuries, most of the populations of the newly created Muslim entities were not Muslim. They were Christian communities, Jewish communities, Zoroastrians, Mandaeans. Further east, you had Hindus, of course. And these were, they continued, but the intelligentsia was then brought in very early on in the 700s, 800s to actually help translate all the surviving intellectual heritage of the known world at the time in terms of what was covered by the so-called Muslim world, to translate into Arabic. So ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, Syriac and Nestorian medical knowledge, Greek philosophy, Hindu treaties, all these wonderful legacies of the ancient world were translated. And the rulers at the time, based in Baghdad, Iraq, really, really encouraged all the great scholars of the time to come to their court and contribute to this wonderful intellectual endeavor. And it is due to this contribution by many different cultures and intellectuals that a lot of the knowledge of the ancient world was preserved and was then later transmitted to Europe through the intermediary of these Arabic translations. And I just stopped here at a case in the museum that gives us some of the examples of how this panned out. So on the left, there is a treatise that talks about the importance of Greek philosophy and Greek philosophers. Then we have a very early copy of Ibn Sina's Qanun, which is a medical treatise that again brought together much of the knowledge of the ancient world, but then also built on it, because one important contribution that the Muslim world made to world civilization and later passed on to Europe to help lay the foundations of modern Western civilization is that they insisted on practical experimentation. So where the Greeks had only philosophized and theorized, the scientists and scholars in the Muslim world really wanted to practice, to observe, and to you would say now undertake empirical research. So that was really a very important moment in time and really had great impact on the centuries to come and the development of Western civilization with the onset of the Renaissance. Now, in other aspects too, the legacy of the ancient world continued when Muslim political systems started to establish themselves. Here we have a fountain from 16th century Egypt. And the mosaic decoration that you see applied here goes back to a very long tradition in the Near East, in the whole area of what is now Syria, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, into Egypt. And all these traditional art forms that were available in the region when the new Muslim powers arrived continued. And the craftsmen that were specialized in those art forms also continued. So again, we have Christian and Jewish craftsmen and also tradesmen who contributed and continued to contribute to the artistic development of what we now call Islamic art. And here's perhaps a good point to make a very important statement about this term Islamic art, because it's very, very misleading. Islamic art as an academic discipline was actually a Western invention of the late 19th, early 20th century, when largely European and then later also American scholars started to have an interest in the material arts of what we now call the Muslim world. And they looked at it very much from their own Western-centric lens. They used their own academic terminologies, paradigms, taxonomies, etc. And initially, they were not at all interested in the people who made these artworks. They studied them for their style, for their aesthetics, for dating them in specific relation to other artworks. And they tried to capture somehow timeless specificities about this art, and eventually came up with this term Islamic art. Now, why is it misleading? Because first of all, it's not all Islamic art. Many of the artworks in our collection, for example, were not made by Muslims. They were made by Christians, they were made by Jewish craftsmen, but by Hindu miniature painters. It's really artworks that were made in an area that was ruled by Muslim dynasties, and that for sure was also impacted by certain philosophies and preoccupations that came from a specifically Islamic mindset and way of looking at life. From a Muslim point of view, Islamic art would only ever be the art that really serves the faith or exudes the principles of the faith. So let me give you an example of these two different ways of looking at Islamic art. So here on the right, in this case, let me maneuver again. You can see two examples of what we call Tiraz textiles. So these are linen textiles that were embroidered, often with silk, under the Fatimid rule of North Africa, Egypt, and parts of Syria between the 10th and the 12th centuries. Now, these linens were made by Coptic Christians who had been creating textiles, had a very well-established textile industry in the Nile Delta well before the Muslim powers arrived. But they continued to see to their trade and to then also supply the court in Cairo with luxury textiles, often embroidered with the titles of the caliphs, with the blessings, religious blessings, and even creating different garments for different hierarchies, for different occasions during the year. So today, this would be called Islamic art, but it was made by Coptic Christians for Muslim and non-Muslim patrons at the court, because the court in Cairo under the Fatimid rulers in itself was not only inhabited by Muslims, but there were Christian doctors, there were Jewish finance ministers. So it was a very, very it was a court driven by meritocracy, so meritocracy, by a commitment to meritocracy. If you were an expert in your field, if you had something to contribute to the system or to the country at large, you were welcome. And this went through every aspect of life. We know, for example, in the Fatimid period, at that time, that Jewish merchants controlled the metal industries. And they had not only international trade works and trade networks, but they had already at that time workshops in India where they would send metal work to their contacts in India to repair something or to create something new. So non-Muslim communities carried a considerable degree of Islamic art. Now, if we look at this panel on the wall, and I'm just racing through my gallery here for you to see how I can best show you this. Now, this, from a Muslim point of view, would most certainly be a piece of Islamic art. It is a niche panel that originally came from a mosque in Damascus in the later 16th century. And it shows a niche, and in the niche there is a lamp. Let me go back a little bit. I want you to see the whole panel. This is the joy of virtual tours. You have to maneuver around a lot before you get the view right. Okay, just bear with me. Okay, it's not allowing me. Anyway, so we have a niche, and in the niche there hangs a lamp. And the lamp has an inscription on it. And the inscription is the Muslim declaration of faith. It says Allah on the top, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. There's no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet or the messenger of God. So this statement is one of the 5 pillars of Islam that include the commitment to God and his prophet, that include prayer, daily prayer, a dedication to charity and looking after the vulnerable, especially, widows and orphans. There's the commitment to fasting once a year in the month of Ramadan to renew your faith and to again grow your empathy with those that have not and that are deprived. And also then, of course, once in your lifetime, if you're physically and financially able, the pilgrimage to Mecca in what is now Saudi Arabia to renew your faith and go back to to the root of the faith. Now, the lamp in itself is interesting because in the Quran, there is a verse that actually refers to God as being like a light that is in a lamp, that is in a niche. So there's symbolism here that takes you right to the heart of the holy book of Muslims. The two footsteps you see are a reference in turn to the Prophet Muhammad and his spiritual presence and support of the message that he received from God. And the candles underneath, of course, are another symbolic reference to light. So here you have an object where you could say from a Muslim perspective, yes, absolutely, this is Islamic art. So something very important to keep in mind as we walk through further through the gallery. So now I had spoken about the coming together of different intellectuals in the pursuit of growing civilization as a whole and driving societies forward. And one of our most famous objects in the museum is this astrolabe from Spain, from the 14th century. And what is fascinating about it is that it has 3 inscriptions in Arabic, in Hebrew, and in Latin. So here we have a physical manifestation of scholars and scientists from different communities coming together to work on understanding, if you like, God's universe better and making it serviceable to the needs of mankind. And of course, the astrolabe as an instrument is also something that, although initially invented by the ancient Greeks, was very much developed in the Muslim world. It had hundreds of different functions that ranged from an aid to navigation, to surveying, to calculating the daily times of prayer and the festivals and holidays and seasons of the year, to being transmitted to the West in the Middle Ages to really then help the development of European sciences and of course also development of astronomy, because it was of course also used to survey the heavens and survey the stars and gain more knowledge. So objects can tell us so many different stories about the contributions that fellow human beings across cultures in unison have made to where we are today. And that is very important to me, because today in the world we live in, the fast world we live in, and the kind of instant gratification that we often seek and that, you know, is so often provided to us by the new technologies we have in hand, sometimes we wonder what the relevance of these objects is today. I mean, yes, they are beautiful, and yes, they have a specific historical context, but if we reflect them as messengers and as gateways to an understanding of relevance that continues to this day, I think they are much more powerful even. Of course, over the centuries, the Muslim civilizations, as we call them in all their diversity, also had legacies that still impact our lives today in very, very direct ways. And I'm just trying again to navigate myself into the right position here. Here we have another beautiful Islamic plate. You already saw a few in the Bellerive Room earlier. And as you can see, this plate is decorated with beautiful flowers. You could even call it a kind of still life, consisting of roses and carnations and tulips. Now, For us nowadays, the tulip is one of our Canadian national flowers, and we are so happy after the long dark winter when we eventually see the little heads popping out of the ground in our gardens. But did you know that the tulip, of course, came to us here in Canada through the Dutch, because during the Second World War, the then Crown Prince Juliana came here to Canada, to Ottawa, away from the woes of the war in her country in the Netherlands. And she gave birth to her daughter Marguerite in Ottawa. And after the Second World War, of course, as an expression of friendship and gratitude between the Netherlands and Canada, the then Queen sent tulips every year, and it became a custom that now goes, across Canada. We have it in Toronto as well, and we remember this beautiful friendship, but also appreciate the messengers of spring. But where did the Dutch get it from? The Dutch got the tulip originally through the intermediary of an ambassador to the Habsburg Empire at the court of the Ottoman sultans in Istanbul in the 16th century. And he had been amazed by the tulip culture that he encountered in Istanbul among the elite. Now, why was the tulip so important to Ottoman Turks at the time in the 16th century? Interestingly, the name of the tulip, Lale, has the same letters that you would use to write the name of God. So already from a mystical point of view, there was a direct connection between the tulip and religious or spiritual notions. And of course, in mystical poetry throughout Muslim civilizations, there often is a reference to the fact that nature is, in a sense, a messenger of the divine, and that all the different qualities that we find in the flora and fauna around us have different messages to give us about the beauty and the impact of the divine in the universe around us. So the culture, again, of tulip growing and breeding different tulips was intimately connected with poetry and with mystical poetry. And the tulips were so important that they were not only grown by sultans and viziers and members of the elite in their palace gardens, but they were also traded. And they were very, very valuable. So when this ambassador brought the tulip bulbs to Europe and they eventually made their way to the Netherlands, the Dutch picked up on the fact that there was good money to be made. And of course, by that time, the demand for tulips in the Ottoman Empire was such that they also saw a new market for them exporting new varieties of tulips back to the Ottoman Empire. So they went then and started mass producing different and new tulip varieties. And some of the bulbs that were created at that time became so expensive that they were traded at the stock market for the value of an Amsterdam mansion. So it was an extremely important luxury commodity, and it was speculated with, so that at some point, there was nearly a stock market crash triggered by reckless speculation in tulips. So whatever you see at the stock market today, it's all happened before. But it's a beautiful example of how the cultures and the civilizations of what we call the Muslim world actually impacted our lives and have continued to impact our lives, and give us the opportunity to also talk about things that we share and enjoy today together. Now, one culture that most definitely has impacted the Muslim world and the world at large over millennia, not only centuries, is China. And again, we can look at that through the arts. Here, I would like to show you a dish that was made in the very famous porcelain kilns of Jingdezhen in China in the early 16th century. But what is fascinating here is that it has an Arabic religious inscription, taharat, which means cleanliness or purity. And the dish is in fact an ablution basin that would have been used in a Muslim household, and probably in a Muslim household within China itself, because at that time, China had significant Muslim communities and also a very significant Muslim presence at the imperial court, where a fascinating coming together of Islamic and Chinese aesthetic and philosophical convictions can be observed through the medium of artworks. But of course, at the same time, blue and white Chinese porcelain was also imported across the Muslim world, as well as into Europe. And, you know, nowadays still, we find the principle of blue and white in contemporary porcelain and even on melamine wares you can buy in Walmart for your picnic. So again, a legacy that we all share. And in the Muslim world, the rulers at the time not only collected blue and white porcelain, but also triggered a local fashion where potters tried to copy Chinese styles to be in on the craze for Chinese porcelain. Now, the potters in the Muslim world had a problem in that they could never have the kaolin porcelain body that was available in China. So they had to use local clay and then adopt opaque white glazes to cover that clay and give the impression of Chinese decoration on top. So here I'm showing you an example from Iran, from Kerman in the later 17th century. And what is fascinating is that not only is the design on this plate very closely referencing earlier Chinese models of about 200 years earlier, but there is even a fake Chinese ruler's mark on the back, because authentic Chinese porcelains, like the plate I just showed you, will always have the imperial ruler's mark on the back of the porcelain. So there was a craze and it was picked up all over the Muslim world and of course beyond, because as you know, Europe also around the very same time started importing blue and white and copying blue and white, and that legacy remained for us, with us until this very day. And on the note of collecting Chinese porcelain, what is also very interesting is that in the Muslim world, we have examples where the rulers were art collectors in their own right that very much appreciated the artworks from different religions and different civilizations. We often have this kind of East-West obsession, and we always think, you know, oh, well, we look at the Muslim world, and it was the West that brought them progress, and the West influenced their arts, and then it became modern, and then it became contemporary. But what is completely under the radar is the fact that within Asia, within the Muslim world, within the Southern Hemisphere, intellectual scholars, art connoisseurs, the elite, rulers were interested in each other's intellectual and artistic creations. So here we have a wonderful example of a very fantastic porcelain jug or ewer that was created in the imperial workshops of Jingdezheng in the early 15th century, but then somehow made it into the art collection, into the treasury of Shah Jahan, one of the Mughal emperors of what is now South Asia. And he obviously was so fascinated by this piece that he also wanted to make his own mark on it. So on the back, there is an inscription that gives his name and also records the year of the acquisition of this ewer. So a lot of learning, of appreciation of each other's arts and cultures, philosophies, intellectual heritage going on within the region itself. And I would love to finish off our whistle-stop tour of the gallery with this wonderful painting here, if I can get my angle right for you again, because it allows us yet again to consider the diversity, the interconnectedness, the globalization, and the universalities of Muslim cultures and world cultures in dialogue in general. This is an oil painting from the late 18th century, and it shows a ruler of Iran, Karim Khan Zand, who actually only controlled the country for a few decades between 1751 and 1779. And he's shown here surrounded by his inner circle, by his confidants and really immediate circle of supporters and friends. And what is fascinating is that when you look closely at the costume that they wear and the aspect of textile that is represented in this painting, you will see a coming together of locally produced textiles and textiles that were very much influenced by Indian textiles, because the designs that you can see with these little bunches of flowers and paisley patterns were very, very much something that was coming in with Indian textiles of different quality and style at the time. Also, fur, which was coming in from Russia and from the more northern countries. And then, of course, Kashmir, because a lot of the turban wraps that you can see are decorated with designs that you can still find in Kashmir in the 19th century. And it gives you a sense again of how globalized the world already was at that time. And of course, globalization is not a modern phenomenon. It actually goes back thousands of years, not only hundreds of years. It shows an appreciation and knowledge of other cultures and the commodities and luxuries that they have to offer. It shows there were trade relations because, of course, traders would bring these textiles and would bring the commodities. And these traders physically traveled and physically interacted and physically lived in different countries as well, and spoke each other's languages. So very much a coming together of different cultures across differences, across different religions that we can access here just by contemplating the costumes and the textiles, and of course also the carpet that the ruler is sitting on in this painting. At the same time, what is fascinating is that the medium in which this scene is captured, the oil painting, is an artistic medium that of course came from beyond the Muslim world, came from the West, and was a new addition to the artistic heritage, which to this point had very much continued the traditional artistic concentration on calligraphy on one hand, and in the Iranian world, of course, also miniature painting, which was never intended to be naturalistic, but was always intended as a visualization and a materialization of intangible, poetic, literary, and philosophical ideals and thoughts and preoccupations. So I would like to leave you here on this multicultural, intercultural, globalized painting. And thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed this artistic meditation with me. And I really hope that I can soon welcome you to the museum in person, and then we can continue our conversations in greater depth. So thank you very much.